I never thought I'd see Daniel again, not after the way things ended. 3 years of my life were spent loving him, believing in him, trusting every promise that fell from his lips. And then just like that, he told me he needed space. I didn't fight it. I didn't beg him to stay. But when I later found out that his space had a name, Melissa, his charming coworker with her perfect curls and sugar-coated smile, I realized that space wasn't distance. It was betrayal. That was a year ago, and since then, I've built walls around myself high enough that even the memory of him couldn't climb over. Or at least that's what I told myself. So when his brother Ethan walked into the cafe that rainy afternoon, everything I had buried began to stir again like dust disturbed by wind. The cafe was nearly empty, save for the soft hum of the espresso machine and the faint rhythm of rain tapping against the window. I looked up from the counter when I heard the door chime, and for a brief second, I thought I was seeing Daniel. Same dark hair, same sharp jawline, but the eyes were different, kinder, lighter. Ethan always had a way of smiling that made people feel safe. He looked surprised to see me, but not uncomfortable. "Anna?" he said, his voice laced with genuine warmth. I froze, my hand tightening around the cup I was cleaning. "Hey," I managed, my voice softer than I wanted it to be. He smiled wider. "It's been a while. We talked like old friends. Small talk at first, cautious, polite. He told me he'd been busy helping Daniel with the wedding plans." My heart skipped a beat at that word. Wedding. It sounded strange coming from his mouth, like an echo I wasn't prepared for. Ethan's gaze softened when he saw my reaction. "You knew about it, right?" he asked gently. I forced a smile. "Yeah, I saw it on social media." That was a lie. I'd blocked Daniel months ago, but friends had sent me screenshots of the engagement photos. Melissa in white, Daniel smiling like he'd never known heartbreak. My throat tightened. "It's fine," I added quickly, trying to sound casual. "I'm happy for him." Ethan studied me for a long moment, then leaned forward slightly. "You should come," he said suddenly. My head snapped up. "What?" He chuckled, almost nervously. "To the wedding. You should come." I laughed, a short, disbelieving sound. "That's insane, Ethan. I'm not invited. And even if I were, why would I want to go to that?" He shrugged, his expression unreadable but earnest. "Because maybe you need to. For closure. For yourself." I opened my mouth to protest, but he continued, his voice lower now. "You gave a lot to him, Anna. You don't deserve to hide away like you did something wrong. You should walk in there with your head high and show him what he lost." His words hit me harder than I wanted to admit. I wanted to laugh it off, to say that I didn't care, but deep down I did. There was a part of me that still hurt. A part of me that wanted to be seen, even if it was just to remind myself that I existed beyond the heartbreak. Ethan left soon after, leaving a small folded piece of paper on the counter before he went. "In case you change your mind," he said with a small smile. I waited until he was gone before opening it. It was the wedding invitation, Daniel and Melissa's names elegantly printed in gold cursive, followed by the date, the venue, and the words, "Together with their families." I read it twice, my chest tightening. My name would never appear in that family line. Yet somehow his brother had placed that card in my hands. For hours after my shift ended, I sat in my apartment staring at it. I imagined the looks, the whispers, the humiliation. Then I imagined walking in there, not as the broken ex, but as someone who had risen above the pain. Someone they couldn't pity anymore. I didn't decide that night, but something inside me began to burn quietly, like an ember waiting for air. The night before the wedding, I stood in front of the mirror, holding a soft silver dress I'd bought years ago for an anniversary dinner that never happened. It had hung untouched in my closet since the breakup, wrapped in plastic like a memory I couldn't quite let go of. I slipped it on, feeling the fabric glide against my skin. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for this exact moment. My reflection stared back at me, older, maybe wiser, but still uncertain. I let out a long breath. "It's not about him," I whispered to myself. "It's about me." My heart didn't believe it completely. but my voice sounded convincing enough. The next morning, I arrived at the venue, a grand hotel ballroom surrounded by gardens blooming with white roses. The parking lot was full, and my stomach twisted as I stepped out of the car. My heels clicked softly against the pavement as I walked toward the entrance. 2 ushers stood by the door, greeting guests with polite smiles. One of them held a clipboard. "Name, please?" he asked. I hesitated, then said, "Anna Carter." His eyes scanned the list and then his brow furrowed. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but I don't see your name here." My cheeks flushed, but before I could answer, a familiar voice broke through the awkward silence. "She's with me." Ethan appeared beside me, his hand gently brushing my elbow. The usher immediately stepped aside, nodding. Ethan smiled down at me. "Told you I'd make sure you got in." My heart fluttered, half from nerves, half from gratitude. "Ethan, this is a terrible idea," I whispered. He shrugged. "Maybe. But sometimes terrible ideas lead to the right moments." He led me inside, and for a second, I froze at the sight before me. The ballroom shimmered under crystal chandeliers. Soft music floated through the air. Guests laughed, champagne glasses clinked, and at the far end of the room stood Daniel, handsome in his black tuxedo, his arm wrapped around Melissa's waist. They looked like the perfect picture of happiness. My breath caught. The noise around me seemed to fade until all I could hear was the dull thud of my heartbeat. I was invisible yet completely exposed. Ethan leaned closer. "You okay?" he murmured. I nodded slowly, though I wasn't sure I meant it. As we moved through the crowd, I caught fragments of whispers. "Isn't that Daniel's ex? She actually showed up? How awkward." I kept my head high, pretending I couldn't hear. I spotted Melissa's mother glance my way and immediately whisper something to a woman beside her. Daniel turned slightly, his eyes scanning the room, and then they met mine. For a moment, everything stopped. His expression froze, the faint smile on his lips faltering as recognition hit. I didn't look away. Instead, I gave a small, polite nod, as if greeting an acquaintance rather than the man who once knew every corner of my heart. The ceremony hadn't started yet, so Ethan guided me to a seat near the back. "You can leave any time," he whispered, but I shook my head. "No," I said quietly. "I'll stay." Watching them stand under the arch of flowers later, exchanging vows, was harder than I'd imagined. Each word of devotion stung like salt in an old wound, yet I couldn't look away. Daniel's voice trembled slightly as he said, "I do," and for some reason, I found that oddly satisfying. Maybe because I knew that the perfect confidence he used to wear like armor was cracking, if only a little. When the crowd cheered, I clapped too, softly, but enough to feel like I'd taken part in closing a chapter of my life. During the reception, I stayed at the edge of the crowd, sipping my drink. Every so often, someone would glance my way, curious but too polite to ask. Ethan stayed close, making light conversation, shielding me from the worst of the gossip. "You're brave," he said quietly. "Most people wouldn't have come." I smiled faintly. "Bravery or stupidity? It's a fine line." He laughed softly. "Maybe both." Then, as if on cue, Daniel and Melissa approached our table. The air grew heavier instantly. "Anna," Daniel said, his voice a mix of surprise and tension. "I didn't know you were coming." I smiled politely. "Ethan invited me." Melissa's lips tightened, but she said nothing. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. "Well, I hope you're enjoying yourself." I met his gaze steadily. "I am. You have a beautiful wedding, Daniel. Congratulations." For a brief moment, something flickered in his eyes. Guilt, maybe, or regret. But I didn't wait to analyze it. I excused myself and walked toward the terrace, needing air. Outside, the evening breeze felt like freedom. I leaned against the railing, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Behind me, the laughter and music felt distant, almost unreal. Then I heard footsteps. Ethan joined me, holding 2 glasses of champagne. "To surviving awkward reunions," he said with a grin, raising his glass. I laughed softly and clinked mine against his. To survive, I echoed. We stood there in silence for a while, the kind of silence that feels comfortable rather than empty. I turned to him. Thank you for inviting me. I don't know what made you think this was a good idea, but somehow it feels right. He smiled gently. I just thought it was time someone reminded you that you didn't lose anything that day. You let go of something that wasn't yours to carry anymore. His words lingered long after I went home that night. As I stood in front of my mirror again, looking at the woman in silver, I realized something had shifted. I didn't feel broken anymore. I felt reclaimed. My name wasn't on that guest list, but that didn't matter. I showed up for myself, and in doing so, I had taken the first step towards something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. The ceremony was beautiful, painfully beautiful, the kind that could make strangers weep. But for me, every vow felt like a knife quietly twisting in my chest. The string quartet played something soft and romantic, and as Daniel's voice trembled slightly while saying, "I do," I felt my heart tighten. Not from longing anymore, but from the ghost of what I once believed in. Sitting in the last row, surrounded by faces that didn't know me but seemed to sense who I was, I tried to disappear into the dim lighting. My hands rested on my lap, fingers intertwined, as if holding myself together. Every so often, I could hear a whisper, my name passing through a stranger's lips, followed by the muffled gasp of recognition. "Is that her?" Someone murmured behind me. "The ex?" Another voice answered, and though I wanted to pretend it didn't matter, each word landed heavy. I told myself I didn't care, that I was here only for closure, but it was a lie I repeated like a prayer just to survive the moment. When the ceremony ended and applause filled the hall, I joined in softly, clapping for two people who had once ripped my heart apart, because that was what dignity looked like, wasn't it? Pretending you're fine even when your pulse is screaming otherwise. I stood, waiting for the crowd to move toward the reception area, and I almost slipped out the side door. But then I saw Ethan at the edge of the crowd, watching me with that same calm, steady gaze he'd worn all day, the one that somehow made it impossible for me to run. He walked over, his voice low and reassuring. "You came this far," he said gently. "Don't hide now." I wanted to protest, to tell him that being here was already too much, but his tone wasn't commanding. It was protective. Before I could object, he offered me his arm. "Come on," he said, his smile soft but firm. "You'll sit with me." I hesitated, glancing toward the front tables, where the groom's family was gathering. "Ethan," I whispered, "that's insane. They'll hate me for it." He leaned closer, his words barely above a whisper. "Let them. They already decided who you were. You don't owe them an apology for showing up." And somehow that was enough to make me follow. The ballroom had transformed since the ceremony, golden lights spilling from chandeliers, laughter floating across tables dressed in white silk, the faint scent of roses in the air. When we reached Ethan's table near the front, conversations paused. The family looked up, their polite smiles faltering when they saw me. Melissa's mother blinked in disbelief, her lips pursing. Daniel's father shifted uncomfortably, clearing his throat. And Daniel himself, he froze mid-sentence, his jaw tightening as his eyes darted from Ethan to me. "What is she doing here?" Melissa whispered sharply, though not sharply enough to hide the venom in her tone. I pretended not to hear and took the seat Ethan offered beside him, keeping my chin high, my movements calm. Inside, my stomach was twisting itself into knots, but on the outside, I refused to let them see a single crack. "You look beautiful," Ethan murmured, and for the first time that night, I allowed myself to exhale. The dinner was long, filled with speeches and forced laughter. Every time I lifted my glass to take a sip, I could feel Daniel's gaze on me, flickering like a candle struggling to stay lit. I wondered what he saw. Did he see the woman he once loved, or the ghost of the guilt he never faced? Either way, I didn't look back. When the toasts began, Ethan stood up, smiling mischievously, and clinked his glass. "To my brother and his lovely bride," he said, and the room erupted in cheers. Then his tone softened as he continued. And to everyone here tonight, may we all have the courage to let go of the wrong people and hold on to the right ones when they come along. His words hung in the air longer than they should have. I saw Daniel shift in his chair, discomfort flickering across his face. Melissa forced a laugh. But Ethan didn't look away. He looked directly at me, raising his glass slightly, and for a moment, it felt like the world had tilted in my favor. When the band began to play, couples drifted toward the dance floor, the lights dimming to a romantic amber glow. I stayed seated, trying to blend in, when Ethan stood suddenly and turned to me. "Dance with me," he said, extending his hand, his voice clear enough to draw attention. Conversation stilled, eyes turned. My breath caught. "Ethan," I whispered, "don't." But he only smiled wider. "Come on, Anna, it's just a dance." The room seemed to shrink around us. Slowly, I placed my hand in his, and he guided me onto the dance floor. The music slowed, a haunting melody that wrapped itself around the silence of the onlookers. I could feel every stare, every ounce of judgment pressing against my back, but Ethan's touch was steady, grounding me. He leaned closer, his voice a whisper meant only for me. "You shouldn't be ashamed," he said. "You're not the one who did wrong." The words slid through me like warmth on a cold night. For months I had carried the weight of embarrassment, of heartbreak, of silence. But in that moment, under the soft glow of chandeliers, it felt like I was being seen again, not as the woman Daniel left, but as the woman who had survived it. Our movements were slow, almost deliberate. He spun me once, and I could see Daniel standing at the edge of the dance floor, his expression dark and unreadable. Melissa's smile had vanished entirely, replaced by a tight-lipped glare. Whispers began to ripple across the room again, but this time they sounded different. Not pitying. Not cruel, curious, intrigued, maybe even admiring. Ethan didn't seem to notice or care. His eyes stayed on mine, unwavering. "They don't deserve the power to make you small," he murmured again, his tone firmer now. "You've spent too long letting their version of you define your worth." My throat tightened, emotion pressing at the corners of my composure. I wanted to say something back, to thank him, to tell him how his kindness felt like a balm I didn't know I needed. But the music swelled, and words felt unnecessary. For those few minutes, it wasn't about revenge or defiance. It was about reclaiming myself. When the song ended, polite applause followed, but it sounded distant, like background noise to a moment that meant more than anyone realized. Ethan gave a small bow, and I curtsied lightly, pretending not to see the disapproving faces around us. We walked back toward the edge of the floor, but before we reached the table, a familiar voice stopped me. "Anna," I turned. Daniel stood a few feet away, his expression unreadable, his voice tight with restrained anger. "Can we talk?" The guests around us tried to pretend they weren't watching, but the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Ethan stepped closer to me, protective, but I placed a hand on his arm and shook my head. "It's fine," I said quietly. Then, to Daniel, outside. The air was cooler on the terrace, the night wind carrying the faint echo of laughter from inside. Daniel followed me out, his hands buried in his pockets. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he said, "What are you doing here, Anna?" His tone wasn't curious. It was accusatory. I turned to face him fully. "You should ask your brother," I said calmly. "He invited me." His jaw clenched. "You know how that looks? You being here? Dancing with him?" I laughed softly, the sound bitter even to my own ears. "I didn't realize your image still depended on what I do." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "This isn't about image. You shouldn't be here. Melissa's upset." "Melissa's always been upset," I shot back before I could stop myself. He flinched slightly. "You think I wanted to hurt you?" he said quietly, his tone suddenly pleading. I looked at him, really looked at him, the man I once thought was everything I needed, and realized I felt nothing. Not rage, not sadness, just clarity. "You already did," I said simply. "But that's not my burden anymore." For a second, he looked like he wanted to say more, but then the door opened and Ethan stepped outside. His gaze flicked between us, protective and calm. "Everything okay out here?" he asked. Daniel straightened, his voice cold now. "Just saying goodbye." I smiled faintly. "Good idea." I brushed past him, the scent of champagne and roses lingering in the air, and Ethan followed, his hand hovering near my back like a silent promise of support. As we walked through the doorway, I glanced over my shoulder one last time. Daniel was still standing there, watching, and for the first time I didn't feel like the one left behind. I was the one walking away. Inside, the music picked up again, louder and faster. Ethan guided me toward the bar, his smile soft. "You handled that perfectly," he said. "You think?" I asked, my voice still trembling slightly. He nodded. "You didn't let him rewrite your story. That's what matters." I looked up at him, realizing that his words had been carrying me all night without me noticing. Something in his eyes, steady, kind, sincere, made my heart ache in a new way. Not from loss, but from recognition. Maybe the kind of love that lasts doesn't come from the ones who break us, but from those who help us rebuild. As the night wore on, laughter slowly replaced tension. The whispers faded. And though I still felt the sting of being uninvited, I understood something profound. Sometimes the places we aren't meant to belong become the very ones where we finally reclaim ourselves. By the time the evening ended and the guests began to leave, I found myself standing on the edge of the dance floor again, watching couples sway under fading lights. Ethan approached, his hands in his pockets, his smile small but real. "You did good, Anna," he said softly. "You showed them strength without ever having to shout." I smiled back, the weight of the night finally lifting from my shoulders. "Thank you for reminding me who I am." He tilted his head, studying me with quiet affection. "Any time." And as I walked out of that ballroom beside him, I realized I hadn't just closed a chapter, I had started writing a new one, even if I didn't yet know where it would lead. The morning after the wedding felt eerily quiet, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Sunlight filtered weakly through my curtains, but I didn't want to move. My phone kept buzzing on the nightstand, notifications, missed calls, and messages piling up like a tidal wave I didn't have the strength to face. When I finally reached for it, I wasn't prepared for what I saw. Dozens of messages, screenshots, and tagged posts filled my feed. Photos from the wedding had already spread like wildfire. Me in that silver dress, dancing with Ethan, smiling under the chandeliers while Daniel watched from the sidelines. Headlines on gossip forums read, "The ex who stole the spotlight and drama at the Harper wedding." My heart should have sunk, but it didn't. I waited for the shame to come, for the regret, for the sting of humiliation, but all I felt was light, as if the weight I'd been carrying for a year had finally fallen away. People could say whatever they wanted. For the first time in months, I didn't care what version of me they chose to believe. Later that afternoon, my phone buzzed again, and this time the name on the screen made me pause. Ethan. I hesitated, thumb hovering over the answer button before I finally swiped. "Hey," I said softly. His voice on the other end sounded hesitant, almost fragile. "Can we meet?" I didn't ask why. Maybe I already knew. 2 hours later, I was sitting in that same cafe where it all started, the one that smelled like coffee and rain. The one where he'd handed me that invitation and unknowingly set everything in motion. He walked in wearing a gray sweater, his hair slightly tousled, his expression unreadable. When he sat down, neither of us spoke at first. The silence stretched long enough that I started to fidget with my cup, tracing the rim just to have something to do with my hands. Then finally he broke it. "I didn't invite you to cause drama," he said quietly, eyes steady on mine. I know it must have felt that way, but that wasn't my intention. I stared at him, searching for any trace of pity or guilt, but all I saw was sincerity. "Then why did you?" I asked. "Why bring me there, Ethan?" "You knew it would. Stir things up." He sighed, his fingers tightening around his cup. "Because someone needed to remind him what he threw away. And because—" His voice faltered for a moment, softer now, almost vulnerable. Because I've cared about you for a long time, Anna. My breath caught. For a second, I thought I'd misheard him. What? He met my eyes again, and there it was. Truth, raw and unguarded. I watched what my brother did to you. I watched how he took your kindness and used it until there was nothing left to take. And even after he left, you never said a bad word about him. You just disappeared. You didn't fight or beg. You just let him go with grace. I don't think I've ever respected anyone more for that. My throat tightened. I didn't know what to say. All those months of heartbreak, all those sleepless nights wondering what I had done wrong. And here was someone telling me that my quiet survival had meant something. Ethan continued, his tone barely above a whisper. When I saw you at the cafe that day, you looked like you'd built a wall around yourself. But I remembered the way you used to smile, the way you used to light up when you talked about painting, about your students, about your dreams. I just wanted to see that again. I didn't care if it made things messy. For a long moment, I couldn't speak. My hands trembled slightly as I set the cup down. Ethan, I don't know what to say. He smiled faintly. You don't have to say anything. I just needed you to know. The rest of that afternoon passed in quiet conversation, about music, about life, about everything and nothing. For the first time in years, I laughed without feeling like something inside me was broken. When we finally stood to leave, he reached out, his fingers brushing mine. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was enough to make my heart flutter in that soft, hesitant way that only happens when something real begins to grow. Days turned into weeks. The storm of gossip faded, replaced by new scandals, new distractions. My life, however, didn't go back to normal, because I wasn't the same person anymore. I started painting again, something I hadn't done since before Daniel. The first brushstroke across the canvas felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. Ethan would visit sometimes, bringing coffee and teasing me about the paint smudges on my hands. He never pushed, never demanded, just showed up. We talked about everything, from his work at the firm to the books he loved as a kid. Slowly, without either of us realizing it, those conversations began to fill the empty spaces in my heart that I thought would stay hollow forever. Then, one rainy afternoon, the past came knocking again, literally. I was locking up the cafe after helping Ethan close when the door swung open. Standing there, soaked from the rain, was Daniel. My stomach tightened, a mix of shock and something close to pity. His eyes were tired, the confident gleam gone. Anna, he said, his voice unsteady. Can we talk? Ethan froze beside me, his posture instantly protective, but I nodded. It's fine, I said quietly. Daniel glanced between us before his gaze dropped. Melissa left, he said finally. She said she couldn't take it anymore. That I was still thinking about you. His voice cracked slightly at the end. I didn't know whether to feel sorry for him or angry that he'd brought his wreckage to my doorstep. I made a mistake, he continued. A huge one. I thought she was what I wanted, but all I could think about during the wedding was you. His eyes searched mine, desperate for a flicker of forgiveness. Do you ever think about us? For a long moment, I didn't answer. I looked at him, really looked at him, and realized that the man standing in front of me wasn't the one I used to love. He was smaller somehow, diminished by his own choices. I shook my head slowly. No, I said softly. Not anymore. His shoulders slumped. So that's it? I nodded. That's it. He ran a hand through his wet hair, frustration bleeding into his tone. Ethan told me you'd moved on. I didn't believe him. I thought, maybe you'd still care. I met his gaze, calm now, steady. I do care, I said. Just not the way you want me to. I care enough to hope you find peace, but not enough to let you pull me back into your chaos. The words came easier than I expected. Maybe because I'd already said goodbye a long time ago, even if I hadn't realized it until now. Ethan stepped forward then, his presence quiet but firm. I think you should go, Daniel, he said evenly. Daniel looked between us again, his expression hardening. "So this is what it's about? You two?" Ethan didn't answer. He didn't have to. The silence said enough. Daniel scoffed softly, shaking his head. "You always did have perfect timing," he muttered before walking out into the rain. I stood there watching the door swing shut behind him, feeling an odd sense of calm settle over me. There was no satisfaction in seeing him hurt, no gloating victory, just peace. A quiet, unshakable peace that comes only when you've truly let go. When I turned, Ethan was still there, watching me carefully. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded. "Yeah, for the first time in a long time, I think I am." He smiled, stepping closer, and for a moment, we just stood there. No words, no promises, just the warmth of something real beginning to bloom in the quiet aftermath of everything that had been destroyed. He reached for my hand, his thumb brushing gently over my skin. "You deserve the kind of love that never makes you doubt yourself," he said softly. "The kind that feels safe." I felt tears prick my eyes, but they weren't from sadness. "Maybe this time," I whispered. "I'll recognize it when it comes." He smiled, his gaze holding mine. "I think you already have." Weeks turned into months, and life found a new rhythm. Ethan and I grew closer in ways that felt natural, unforced. Two people rebuilding from broken places, learning that love doesn't always have to be fireworks. Sometimes it's quiet mornings, laughter over spilled coffee, and the comfort of knowing someone chooses you not because you're convenient, but because you're enough. One afternoon, as we closed the cafe together, I caught my reflection in the window. The same woman who had walked into that wedding uninvited, but somehow everything about her looked different. Stronger, softer, free. Then, one day, while sorting through an old box of things I'd kept from my relationship with Daniel, photos, letters, ticket stubs, I found the wedding invitation Ethan had given me. I stared at it for a long time, tracing the embossed gold lettering with my finger. Together with their families, the irony wasn't lost on me. I had walked into that wedding unwanted, unlisted, unseen, and walked out reclaiming everything I had once lost: my dignity, my peace, and something even better, myself. I slipped the invitation back into the box and smiled. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even nostalgic. I was simply grateful. Because without that moment, without that chaos, I might never have found the strength to step into the life that was waiting for me. That night, as Ethan and I sat under the glow of the cafe lights, he reached across the table and took my hand. "Do you ever think about that day?" he asked, a teasing smile tugging at his lips. I laughed softly. "Which one?" "The wedding," he said. "When you walked in and the entire room forgot to breathe." I rolled my eyes. "Please don't remind me." He grinned. "I will never forget it. You walked in like you owned the place." I smiled at that, thinking about how terrified I'd been and how different it all seemed now. "I wasn't on the guest list," I said quietly, "but I guess I was meant to be there anyway." He squeezed my hand gently. "You were meant to be here," he said, glancing around the cafe. "With me." And for the first time, I believed him. Not because it was romantic, but because it was true. I wasn't on the guest list, but maybe, just maybe, I was always meant to be invited into something far better. A new beginning, written not out of revenge, but redemption. And this time, I was finally the one choosing who got a place in my story.